Archaeodeath, Death and Memory, Past and Present, with Professor Howard Williams.
But I want to do something a little bit more serious to start off with this week, because there are many contentious topics affecting archaeology in today's world, and many ways in which archaeology intersects. Archaeology and heritage protection, conservation and management intersects with some of contemporary world issues. And one issue I haven't addressed for a while, namely the war in Ukraine. And I thought it'd be useful for you to give you an update on some of the latest thinking and research by archaeologists on the war in Ukraine, is to read from the latest article that's been published on the topic. So there is Charlotte Higgins on the 26th on Boxing Day in The Guardian produced a article called "Battle for the Past: The Ukrainians Trying to Save Their Archaeological Treasure Amid War," and it links to an article published in the journal Antiquity as part of their the Antiquity is a big academic journal, called "The Tools of War: Conflict and the Destruction of Ukrainian Cultural Heritage," and it's co-authored by Pavlov, and my pronunciation of Ukrainian names is going to have to be forgiven, okay? Pavlov Zhidovsky, Ian Kite of the University of Notre Dame in the United States, Vladislav Skorodov, Ivan Zodsenko, Zevodov Ivankin, William Donnarumma, and Sean Field. And I want to read this out to you because I think for anyone who's interested in archaeology's connection to the present day, I think we cannot ignore the situation going on in the Ukraine. And I thought it would capture many points in and then I shall do some reflections and answer some questions about it. So if everyone's okay with that as a thing to do, either sod off if that's not of interest to you, or stay around if you do, I will address the current situation of archaeological research on cultural destruction. So this is the use of archaeological techniques to observe, record, and reflect on the cultural destruction going on in war zones. Okay, so the abstract reads of this article, called "Tools of War." The military invasion of Ukraine has destroyed and damaged extensive built cultural heritage, including churches, museums and monuments. Based on site visits conducted since the invasion, we outline damage to the 11th century sites of Boholiny Hory, Chercheniv, and the church citadel and graveyard at Oster, Chercheniv Oblast. And so the introduction reads: the full-scale Russian military invasion of Ukraine on the 24th of February 2022 has resulted in... I said 2021 for my video. Yes, I meant last year. Sorry, 2022. It's 2023 now. So yes, on the 24th of February 2022 has resulted in a significant loss of human lives, the national and international displacement of many Ukrainian people, and the destruction of cultural heritage aimed at erasing public history and memory. So the war is against people, but it's against landscape, and it's against the culture and the social memories of those people, they're arguing. And I'll occasionally interject to explain things. The international community has become increasingly aware of the destruction of Ukrainian cultural heritage, such as highly visible architectural monuments, religious buildings and public monuments. Even in deoccupied regions, including Chercheniv and Kharkiv, landmines and unexploded munitions restrict access to many areas, and it is not possible to access how much damage has taken place. In museums in occupied regions, including Kherson, Melitopol and Mariupol, collections have been expropriated and transferred to Russia. In other words, nicked. While in other cases, artefacts have been pillaged by Russian soldiers to keep or sell. So there's the casual accidental damage, deliberate targeting of cultural heritage, systematic state-sanctioned acquisition of museum collections, and then individual soldiers doing pillaging and selling, right? Researchers are currently trying to document the massive destruction of Ukrainian cultural heritage through the use of satellite data, such as that seen by the US Conflict Observatory, and with ground observation. Based on case studies, we provide the first on-the-ground assessment of how the Russian invasion has destroyed or damaged Ukrainian cultural heritage. So the first case study is Ukrainian cultural heritage in broad terms, and they say that given the ongoing conflict, it is not yet possible to assess the damage of the cultural heritage along the front lines of the Kharkiv, Donetsk, Luhansk, Zaporizhia, and Kherson regions since the deoccupation of the Kyiv, Zhytomyr, Checheniv, and Mykolaiv regions in June 2022. However, a preliminary understanding of the scale and nature of destruction in some areas has developed. So field survey research demonstrates extensive damage to several important sites. So these are the areas the Russians invaded and were knocked back, right, last summer. Including major damage to the Makariev Hill Fort, Bilohodka, the Vizhgorod Hill Fort in Kiev region, significant destruction of the 10th to 12th century Shestovitsia and Boldnaya Hora barrows in the Chernihiv region, and extensive damages to churches, historic buildings of the 11th, 12th centuries in strategic landscape locations. To better understand the nature of destruction of Ukrainian cultural heritage, we will briefly highlight the scale of damage at cultural sites by looking at the case studies in the Chernihiv region. And it starts off by then looking at the next section, which is destruction of built heritage. So remember, heritage takes different forms. We're looking at earthwork sites, hill forts, barrows. Many of these of the sites they're looking at go back to the Rus state, the Viking Rus state, if you like. And others are about built heritage, buildings that date back to the Middle Ages. So that's what they're going to be surveying. So the destruction of built heritage is their first focus. The damage of built cultural heritage in northern, eastern and southern Ukraine, including churches, monuments and libraries, has been extensive. Typical of this is the badly damaged Children's Regional Library, former Vassiliev Tarnovsky Museum of Ukrainian Antiquities in Chernihiv. This UNESCO-listed Gothic Revival heritage building was bombed by the Russians on the 11th of March 2022, destroying the roof and most of the walls. Online photogrammetry documentation by the War Close-Up Research Group provides viewers with a sense of the damage, a good sense of the damage that has taken place. Another example is the Church of the Ascension, constructed in 1913 on the site of an earlier wooden 1781 church in Lukashivka, Chernihiv region. The church was badly damaged during fierce battles in March 2022, with the majority of the wood roof destroyed, burning of the inside and the destruction of windows and glasswork. The destruction to this building has also been documented by the War Close-Up Research. And their next section is called Cultural Heritage Below the Surface. So complementing that above ground damage and examples, they then look beneath the surface at earthworks and below ground features. While the international community and archaeologists are aware that some damage of built heritage places has taken place in Ukraine, that they are largely unaware of the extensive scale of destruction in northern, eastern and southern Ukraine. The combination of modern weapons and the widespread use of First World War type trench systems is destroying buried cultural heritage at an alarming rate. For example, located on the riverbank at Chernihiv is the mound complex of Boldnaya Hora. Covering over 1.2 hectares, Boldnaya Hora contains 230 burial mounds and is one of the largest 11th century, so that's late Viking age, cemetery sites in Ukraine. Some of these well-preserved burial mounds are up to 6 metres high and have a diameter of 20 metres plus. During February and March 2022, the Russian military repeatedly attacked Boldnaya Hora with artillery and missiles, causing extensive damage to neighbouring residential areas. These attacks, as well as the necessary construction of defensive trenches by the Ukrainian military for protection, resulted in significant damage to many of the mounds. So they're admitting it's by both sides, and it's a result of intense warfare and trench building in the area of the burial mounds. Another example of the destruction of buried cultural heritage in Ukraine is the damage to the 11th century church, citadel and graveyard at Uster, Chernihiv Oblast. During the Russian siege of Chernihiv, approximately 200 metres of defensive trenches were constructed in March 2022. This partially destroyed the remains of a brick foundation of the church, as well as the remains of a previously unidentified graveyard. Archaeological field research in Uster in March and April 2023 identified the destruction of at least 7 11th century human burials. Ongoing photogrammetry is being used to assess the scale of destruction with the construction of military trenches at Uster and to consider what future assessment and mitigation will be required. The full-scale Russian invasion has destroyed and damaged thousands of Ukrainian cultural heritage sites, many of which are below ground and previously unrecorded. So, hi everybody, I'm just reading, just to give you an update of what I'm doing, I'm going through the latest and really the first attempt to systematically evaluate the impact of the Russian military invasion of Ukraine on the cultural heritage of the said country. The next section is called Recognising Destruction of the Area's Cultural Heritage. It is currently impossible to quantify the damage and destruction of Ukrainian cultural heritage. Ongoing missile and drone strikes on cultural sites, such as on the 19th of August 2023 drone strike on the Church Niniv Theatre that killed 9 people and wounded 144, or the Russian strike on the landmark Orthodox Cathedral in Odessa, highlight the interconnected loss of human lives and targeting of cultural heritage. In this static ground war that is characterised by military trenches used on the scale similar to the Second World War, Ukrainian cultural heritage is being destroyed at a rate not seen since 1945. Archaeologists are now able to access some of the regions, but ongoing combat in other regions makes it impossible to visit, let alone assess the damage on the built cultural heritage, such as churches, monuments and museums. Potentially more problematic and less understood is the destruction of the buried heritage. The future identification and documentation of damaged cultural heritage will require a multi-stage process drawing on remote sensing, but most of all site visits. In a situation where hostilities are far from over, it is important that scientists, specialists of cultural heritage protection bodies and public activists collect information on the scale and nature of damage and destruction of archaeological cultural sites. So this is a very short little piece, but it's simply to present the situation as is. The ongoing international efforts are being made to record this, and I talked about this in a recent video about what's going on in Gaza, namely that while there's so much misinformation going on, and while the picture is far from clear, as well as the loss of human life, which is of course the priority is human life and human suffering, we do have to also be aware that archaeologists will be taking an active role in the recording of the damage and destruction onto the very landscapes and places, because this isn't simply about recording stuff. This is about things that are objectively, neutrally valued as by the international community as of value. Churches, museums, monuments, but also the broader cultural heritage of any trench being dug, any munition explosion is going to damage subsurface archaeology, including sites in Ukraine that go back to the very beginning of the advent of farming and before. So some amazing cultural sites in Ukraine, not simply so I mean in that regard it might be worthwhile. I compliment that by reading out Charlotte Higgins's article from Boxing Day, The Battle for the Past, Ukrainians trying to save their archaeological treasure amid war. In Ukraine's history-rich east, the war on Russia is hastening both historical discoveries and the destruction of treasures. One day in August, Olesenska Kozlov of the 79th Air Assault Brigade of the Ukrainian Armed Forces were digging a trench in the forest near the Siversky Donets River in eastern Ukraine. It was hot and humid. There were mosquitoes everywhere. From the opposite side of the bank, the Russians were shelling constantly. He and his 4-strong group had taken a break from their back-breaking, dangerous work when one of them mentioned that he'd seen fragments of ceramics in the soil. Kozlov took a look. There were modern potsherds washed up. Maybe they were modern potsherds washed up by the river flooding, he thought. But then more objects began to see fragments of ceramics in the soil. Kozlov took a look. There were modern potsherds washed up. Maybe they were modern potsherds washed up by the river flooding, he thought. But then more objects began to understatement. You need to dig the trenches as fast as possible. Nevertheless, the group gathered what artefacts they could. Later, Kozlov made an improvised museum from an ammunition box, labelled the objects to show his senior officers. He also called for Dr. Serhiy Telesenko of the Ukrainian Institute of Archaeology. According to Telesenko's assessment, Kozlov and his fellow soldiers had stumbled on an ancient burial site dating back to perhaps 5,000 years to the Stone Age, but also encompassing material from the Neolithic or Copper Age and the catacomb culture of the Middle Bronze Age that flourished in the steppe in the 3rd to 2nd century BCE. Ukraine is a country spectacularly rich in ancient archaeology, whether of the Scythians with their horses and fine worked gold, who ranged across the steppes from the 9th to the 2nd century BC, to the intriguing Stone Age Tritina Tripilia culture, which has produced remarkable elaborately decorated ceramics and huge city-scale megasites, or to this is weirdly ordered actually, but then an or of the Greeks who established trading emporia on the Black Sea coast. So that's not really in chronological order, that jumps around. But anyway, the idea is the rich cultures we have of Ukraine. But in a country with limited resources for cultural protection, Russia's full-scale invasion has meant the onslaught of destruction on this rich record of the past. The full extent of the damage is impossibly accurately to assess, but the research published this month in the journal Antiquity, which I've just read out to you, points to the difficulty of on-the-ground assessment, even in liberated areas such as Chernihiv Oblast in the north and Kharkiv in the east, because of the danger of landmines and unexploded munitions. Meanwhile, museum collections from occupied cities such as Melitopol, Kherson and Mariupol have been lifted and taken wholesale to Russia and Crimea. Cultural heritage of all kinds, including churches and other monuments, has been targeted, with destruction at a rate not seen since 1945, according to the authors, as I said. The trench digging is destroying buried cultural heritage at an alarming rate, they add. The authors regard archaeological sites of particular concern are as more problematic and less understood than the other forms of cultural heritage. So Telezenko is an expert in the extraordinary archaeological landscape of eastern Ukraine, especially the Luhansk region, whose grasslands are dotted with distinctive kurgans or ancient burial mounds that stand proud above the flat steppe landscape. Archaeologists and linguists, experts, have associated this prehistory with the speakers of the posited long-lost Proto-Indo-European, from which languages spoken in countries from India to Scandinavia and Britain derive. Telezenko's own fieldwork in Luhansk Oblast was disrupted by the Russian-backed separatist takeover of the region in 2014 and has been completely halted by Russian full-scale invasion. Instead of excavating, he is now using open-source satellite imagery to chart the destruction and damage of burial mounds through shelling and other military activity. Since 2014, he said, speaking from his office in Kyiv, 1,863 kurgans, though the burial mounds, have been affected. Especially before the widespread use of drones, the mounds were useful command points for the military on both sides, he said. The damage, he said, is a huge loss, not just to archaeology locally, but to this that this has a global significance. Set against this destruction, though, there are many discoveries like Kozlov's Telezenko, keen to impart best practice to European troops, is the author of a military handbook titled Archaeology and Monuments in War, offering instructions on what to do if soldiers discover an archaeological site. Published in 2019, the handbook has been distributed to officers in the armed forces of Ukraine. The guide begins with a reminder of the Hague Convention, the 1954 multinational treaty dedicated to the protection of cultural property during conflict. Ideally, the handbook counsels the military should completely avoid archaeological sites. However, if the process of destruction is already irreversible, and in the absence of a threat to life and health of military personnel, there are procedures to be followed. The handbook advises soldiers on how to photograph a site with multiple angles, using a smartphone compass app to establish orientation and placing a stick to indicate north. Precise coordinates should be taken using GPS. Objects should also be photographed, then packaged. Rubbish bags or supermarket bags are best, and conveyed to the nearest safe museum or to the National Institute of Archaeology. Last year, a group of Chechen volunteers fighting for in the Sheikh Mansour battalion of the Ukrainian side sent Telezenko a group of medieval kaka dishes and Bronze Age fragments of vessels. They found them by chance, he said, in the village of Lopaskina in the Luhansk region. The Turkic Khazar people were the founders of an early medieval empire north and east of the Black Sea. The Chechens carefully photographed the objects, and against the background of an ammunition box, lacking a ruler, usually included for scale and archaeological pictures, they used the other standard-sized items they had to hand, a bullet and a toothbrush. I haven't heard from these fighters since February, said Telezenko. It's possible they haven't made it. Despite such examples of best practice, though, theft of cultural heritage is rife. When the Kharkova Dam in the Kherson region was blown in June, for example, causing catastrophic flooding, the vast 832 square mile reservoir above it drained out, revealing a treasure trove of archaeological objects in the silt. There was an open discussion with the national police forces trying to do something about it, but YouTube is full of videos of people looting despite the dangers, said Telezenko. Items illegally taken from the area, despite the danger of shelling and landmines, he says, including stone and Bronze Age objects, Roman potsherds, and medieval and Cossack artefacts. Such opportunities on both sides in the conflict, military and civilian, are often known as black archaeologists. It is a phrase that Telezenko rejects. What would you call me then? A white archaeologist? A gold archaeologist? These people are simply looters. So anyway, the phrase black archaeologist obviously doesn't translate well in the West, but in Eastern Europe it's been in the sense of black market, as is the use of the term, not by me obviously, but that obviously has confusing connotations elsewhere. But I think that piece of journalism and the antiquity article in combination do give a sense of where we are at with the conflict in Ukraine, and also how this then affects our thinking regarding the war elsewhere. And while you could say, well, this is inevitable, this is always what's going to happen, and yes, and it's perhaps the least priority, it is something that for years to come archaeologists are going to have to start contending with. The mapping, the recording of the damage, the potential prosecution of those responsible if appropriate, and the attempts to mitigate that loss with some records. And remember, the potential prosecution of those responsible if appropriate, and the attempts to mitigate that loss with some records. And remember, that addresses the serpent ramparts of Ukraine, and these are massive linear earthworks probably built by the Rus state against the Pechenegs in the 11th century. And these major earthworks of banks and ditches and have actually been refortified in some cases in the military conflict, particularly the assault on Kyiv, and are now being also damaged by the ongoing conflict. So that's the cheery topic of today, but I thought it would be useful to remind you all of this, that the work of archaeologists is not simply about studying the past, but recording damage to cultural heritage as part of ongoing conflict zones. And inevitably, sadly, also archaeologists working in conflict zones will be in future recording details of the conflict that are not otherwise available from written sources. Happy days. War has never been kind to historical material, says Cody Man. Well, that's a general truth, but it varies, of course, considerably depending on the way that wars are performed and enacted. And wars that are deliberately targeting cultural heritage for active destruction, rather than just passive, incidental dimensions, is a further aspect of the conflict in Palestine and the conflict in Ukraine. The elimination and appropriation of the past has often been a deliberate strategy of cultural domination and military occupation. So these things go hand in hand. So the fact that wholesale museum art collections and archaeological collections have been removed from Ukrainian museums for their protection is not as benign as it might be seen on first glance, if that makes sense. It's the deliberate distinction that gets me. Yeah, obviously there's a spectrum of probability. In some cases you can say, well, if soldiers are forced to dig a trench at a strategic location, the last thing they're going to think about is, am I damaging a Bronze Age site? And you can't, there's not a deliberate, it's not a deliberate act. And there are the cases where maybe there's some ambiguity. Was that deliberate, or is it just they had to move the tanks through that North Gaza cemetery because that's what the tanks had to do and the graves were incidental? Or was it an act of deliberate destruction? Likewise, is protecting or removing museum collections, there is a deliberate, systematic plundering. And the antiquities market is awash with that mixture of strategic looting for political or economic ends, and these things are always interlinked, and a flood of casual, souvenir taking, trophy taking, circulating of objects for personal gain. So it's a real complex mix. it makes me wonder how the enemies of Rome felt when their towns and monuments were plundered. Well, I think yes, there are analogies to the ancient world. This is, on one level, nothing new, and one person's trophy is another person's plunder, and these things sort of can be seen deep in time. I mean, the British landscape is full of Russian militaria, for example, from the Crimea. German militaria in war memorials and other locations. So, there's many ways in which, and French, of course, got lots of French militaria, lots of Waterloo memorabilia, for example, souvenirs circulating. First World War, Second World War. People love militaria that's been taken as trophies or personal items, but also has a profit element to it. And now stuff can so there's a market here that's being fed and is motivating people in these acts. So it's a mess where you can't. And again, I have to say, as with other war zones, such as it's often the Western powers and the Western markets that are working hand in hand. I mean, not in knowledge of each other often, but it's American buyers that are gobbling this stuff up, because the antiquities market is driven by America. And so you could say that most of the terrorist activity of ISIS, for example, was funded by Americans buying shit online, buying antiquities in the last 15 years. And likewise, this is not a small amount of potential profit. Obviously, not directly by the Russian state, but indirectly by other groups for transferring money into transferring artifacts into money, into that finding a legitimate cover. What's the word I'm looking for here? My brain has lost me. Fencing, basically. Yeah. So you have the Parthenon, Matthew. Yes, absolutely. So there's always a way of plausible deniability. Oh, I didn't happen to know these things were there. But in a world where we have such detailed mapping and knowledge of cultural sites, I think the excuse that I just simply that military didn't know where they were targeting is less and less viable. So anyway, those are my thoughts for a Wednesday after Christmas. What can be done about it, Matthew? I don't know. I suppose in the case of Russia, international pressures have not prevailed. The invasion has happened, and the east bank of the left-hand bank of the Dnieper is still held by Russia, and perhaps will be for decades. In the meantime, documenting and retrieving and consolidating what we know about these sites is the best we can do. And if we are funneling masses of arms into Ukraine, then some money should also be furnished for archaeologists to do this kind of really invaluable and important research to support Ukrainian archaeologists and heritage professionals in rebuilding what they can of their collections and their records. So I think there is a lot of financial support and moral support, but in terms of direct intervention, it's rather futile, isn't it? Do you think? There's not much we can do on an individual level, but it's about lobbying, making people aware that we should not forget about the cultural heritage as part. And of course, every time I talk about cultural heritage in war zones, there's usually an academic from a certain university, who will peep up and say, well, all you care about is cultural heritage. What about the people? And of course, no one is saying that the people are not the priority. It's about trying to understand that for those people, their cultural heritage is part of their identity. And we've seen Ukraine swept by, vicious genocides on multiple occasions. And the cultural heritage of those people is part of the story that has been forgotten and easily obliterated. So we need to be aware of this is not just about this war. This is about the succession of conflicts that have obliterated the cultural heritage of the people of Ukraine, including the communist era, but before that with the Nazi invasions, and before that the Soviet era before the Nazi invasions. So you have both sides of the Second World War as well as the Second World War itself, if that makes sense. Thank you for joining me, my loyal archaeo-deathlings. and speak again very soon. And I hope we can have more chats about things that are not quite as grim as war zone archaeology, and have some other things to talk about. Have a good evening, folks. Take care.
If you've enjoyed this Archaeodeath video, why not check out the Archaeodeath blog at howardwilliamsblog.wordpress.com.